The Polish-Soviet War erupted in 1920 in the aftermath of World War I. The root causes were twofold: a territorial dispute dating back to Polish-Russian wars in the 17th–18th centuries, and a clash of ideology due to USSR's goal of spreading communist rule further west, to Europe. At the time both countries had just undergone transition. In 1918 Poland reclaimed independence after 123 years of partitions. In 1917, the October Revolution replaced tsarist autocracy in Russia with Soviet rule. The war ended with the Treaty of Riga in 1920, which settled the border issue and regulated Polish-Soviet relations until the German-Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. Soviet forces in early 1920. Soviet forces had won a recent series of major victories against the White Russians, defeating Denikin, and had signed peace treaties with Latvia and Estonia. The Polish front, formerly a distraction, became the most important war theatre when majority of Soviet resources and forces were diverted into it. In January 1920, the Red Army began concentrating a 700,000-strong force near the Berezina River and in the Belarusian SSR. The Red Army totaled 5 million, with additional millions of Russian recruits to draw from, but much of that force was still engaged in the Civil War. This number of troops were far less virile than the number of weapons available, and only 1 in 9 soldiers could be properly classified a fighting man. In the course of 1920, almost 800,000 Red Army personnel were sent to fight in the Polish War, of whom 402,000 went to the Western Front and 355,000 to the armies of the Southwest Front in Galicia. The Soviet manpower pool in the West was estimated at 790,000. The Soviets had at their disposal much military equipment left by withdrawing German armies, and modern Allied armaments captured from the White Russians and the Allied expeditionary forces following the defeat in the Russian Civil War. With the new forces, Soviet High Command planned new offensive in late April-May. Bolshevik commanders in the Red Army's coming offensive would include Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Leon Trotsky, the future Soviet ruler Joseph Stalin, and the founder of the Cheka secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky. Polish forces in early 1920. The Polish army was made up of soldiers who had formerly served in the various partitioning empires, supported by inexperienced volunteers and recruits. Logistics were a nightmare, relying on whatever equipment was left over from World War I and could be captured. The Polish army employed guns made in 5 countries, and rifles manufactured in 6, each using different ammunition. Before the Battle of Warsaw, the 1st Legion's infantry division comprised 3 regiments, one of which was armed with German Mauser rifles, a second with French Lebel rifles, while the 3rd used Russian Mosin-Nagant rifles. Each make of weapon took ammunition of a different caliber. The Polish forces grew from approximately 100,000 in 1918 to over 500,000 in early 1920. On the 20th of August 1920, Polish army had reached the strength of 737,767, so there was rough numerical parity between the Polish army and the Soviet forces acting against it. Polish intelligence was aware that Soviets have been prepared for a new offensive, and Polish High Command decided to launch their own offensive. Before the Soviets, the plan for Operation Kiev was more ambitious than simply to defeat the Red Army on Poland's southern flank. It aimed at creating a friendly government on the captured Ukrainian territories. Afterwards, Pilsudski and Polish General Staff planned to reassign the Third Army to the north, where Polish planners expected a major Red Army's counteroffensive. Operation Kiev, Until April, the Polish forces had been slowly but steadily advancing eastward. By early January 1920, Polish forces had reached the line of USZYCA Ploskira Konstantina Sipiertaukazwa Oluskaborg Bobrusk Berezina Dinnerberg. New Latvian government requested Polish help in capturing Dinnerberg, and it was, after heavy fighting by the Polish 1st and 3rd Legion divisions under Rydzmili, it was then handed to the Latvians, who viewed the Poles as liberators. By March, Polish forces had driven a wedge between Soviet forces north and south, capturing the towns of Mizyras and Kalenkovice, significantly disrupting Soviet plans for an early offensive. On April 24, Poland began its main offensive, Operation Kiev, aimed at creating an independent Ukraine to become part of Pilsudski's Międzymorze Federation and an ally against the Soviets. Poland was assisted by the Allied forces of Szymon Petlura's Ukrainian People's Republic, the Polish Third Army under Rydzmili, supported by Sixth Army under W. Ilskowicz, and the Second Army under Listovsky, easily won border clashes with the Red Army in Ukraine, which was weakened by dissent and Galician uprisings. The combined Polish-Ukrainian forces captured Kiev on May 7, encountering only token resistance. The Bolshevik forces, though in bad shape, avoided complete destruction. The Polish offensive halted at Kiev, although it did capture a small bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Polish forces began preparing for an offensive towards north and the city of Lublin, which would open the shortest train communication between Polish-held Minsk and Kiev. A Polish-Ukrainian propaganda campaign aimed at the formation of a Ukrainian army capable of defending Ukraine, while initially successful, had to be abandoned before it yielded any significant results. The population was tired by several years of war, and the Ukrainian army attained a strength of only 2 divisions. Polish military thrusts soon met with the Red Army counterattack. The Soviet Southwest Front was commanded by Alexander Ilyich Yegorov. On the 15th of May, the Soviet 15th Army attacked Polish positions near Ala, and the 16th Army crossed the Berezina River between Boryso and Bobrusk. Polish forces in that area, preparing for an offensive towards Lublin, managed to push the Soviet forces back into the river, but were unable to pursue their own planned offensive. In the north, Polish forces had done much worse. The Polish First Army was defeated and started a retreat towards Molodeczno, pursued by the 15th Army, which had recaptured the territory between Dzwina and Berezina. Polish forces attempted to take advantage of the exposed Soviet flanks. Army Arizowa attacking from Wyazhny and Grupa Skiosiego attacking from Boryso were supposed to envelope and crush the advancing Soviet forces, and Soviet reinforcements be stopped by the First Army. This time the First Army did better, but the enveloping forces still failed to stop the Soviet advance. By the end of May, the front had stabilized near the small river Vuta, and Soviet forces began preparing for the next push, concentrating in the Polotsk region. On May 24, 1920, the Polish-Ukrainian forces in the south clashed with the Semyon Budny's famous 1st Cavalry Army. The Polish-Ukrainian forces succeeded in slowing and even defeating the Red Army on a number of occasions. Morale was high. The Polish-Ukrainian forces were eager to defend Ukraine and were confident in their ability to succeed. Polish High Command underestimated the quality of both Budny's forces and the tactical role of cavalry, which hadn't fared well in the First World War trench warfare. Repeated attacks by Budny's Cossack cavalry, however, broke the Polish-Ukrainian front on June 5 and allowed mobile cavalry units to disrupt the Polish rear communication and logistics. By June 10, the Polish armies were in retreat along the entire front. Soviet forces undergo Lukov crossed Dnieper west of Zernyo, cutting the rail communication in that region, and Soviet forces under Ukir captured the Bila Cerkva. The Polish Third Army in Kiev faced the danger of being completely enveloped. It was a bitter day for the Poles and Ukrainians when, on June 13, they abandoned Kiev to the Bolsheviks. A small group of Petli-Uras Ukrainians did not lose the morale and fought with determination throughout the rest of the war. In the face of near unlimited Russian reserves and slow growth of the Ukrainian army, the Polish and Ukrainian forces were ordered to retreat. Bolshevik victories. The commander of the Polish Third Army in Ukraine, General Rydzmily, decided to break through toward the northwest and the town of Korosin, thus avoiding a direct confrontation with the bulk of Soviet 1st Cavalry Army near Koziatin. Soviet forces were plagued by communication and coordination difficulties, and Polish forces managed to withdraw in orderly fashion and relatively unscathed. They were tied down in Ukraine and lacked sufficient strength to support Poland's northern front and reinforce the defenses at the Auta River for the decisive battle that was soon to take place there. Polish Third Army and newly formed Second Army regrouped near Slucha and started a series of their own counterattacks. However, Polish counterattacks in June and July all failed after initial successes. In the battles, Bolsheviks were delayed, but eventually Budany's forces advanced east. When eventually in mid-July Bolsheviks' forces in Ukraine appeared to have been stopped by Polish forces, a new Soviet offensive north would prove even more devastating for the Polish forces. Poland's 200-mile-long front was manned by a thin line of 120,000 troops of the 1st and 4th Armies and Group Polski. Logistics were a problem, and the force had inadequate support of only 460 artillery pieces. Gen. Szyetecki, commander of the Polish Northeast Front, had no strategic reserves, and some forces have been shuffled south to stop the Soviet offensive in Ukraine and Galicia. This approach to holding ground harked back to Great War practice of establishing a fortified line of defense, where it was a viable strategy on the Western Front, where each inch was saturated with troops, machine guns and artillery. The spacious fields of the Eastern Front would require a much larger force than those fielded by the Allies and the Central Powers in the West. Pilsudski tried to formulate a new strategy of strategy de plein air, rather than to try to tie his insufficient forces to mostly inexistent, fixed positions. But his suggestions were not met with approval of other commanding officers. Meanwhile, the Red Army's Northwest Front was commanded by the young General Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky forces of 108,000 infantry and 11,000 cavalry, supported by 722 artillery pieces and 2,913 machine guns, were divided into 1 cavalry corps and 4 armies, the 3rd Cavalry and 4th, 15th, 3rd and 16th Armies, deployed respectively from north to south, with the advantage of being able to plan their offensive. Crucially, the Russians were able to achieve a 4-to-1 force advantage in the planned breakthrough points. Soviet offensive began on July 4 along the axis Smolensk-Brest-Litovsk, crossing rivers of Auta and Berezina. The Northern 3rd Cavalry Corps of G.E.J. Chan was to envelope Polish forces from the north, moving near Lithuanian and Prussian border territories, both unfriendly to Poland. 4th, 15th and 3rd Armies were to push decisively west, supported from south by the 16th Army and Grupa Mościska. For the 3 days the Polish forces held, yet despite local victories, such as when 2 battalions of the Polish 33rd Infantry Regiment held the advance of 2.5 Red Army divisions for a full day, securing the northern flank of the Polish front. The Russians' numerical superiority eventually won them the day. Tukhachevsky's plan to break through and push the southwest Polish units into the Pinsk marshes failed, but the northern theatre proven to be his decisive victory. Gej broke through the northern Polish units on the first day of the offensive, and Polish First Army, pursued by Gej forces, started a disorganized retreat. From July 7, the Polish forces were in full retreat on the entire front. Poles attempted to regroup at the heavily fortified line of German World War I field fortifications. The Battle for Wilno took place here from July 11 to July 14. Once again, however, the Polish troops were unable to man the whole front, and Soviet forces broke through one of the weak points in the north. Gej forces, supported by Lithuanian forces, captured Wilno on the 14th of July, making Polish plans for defensive along old German trenches useless. On the 19th of July Grodno fell, and after a failed Polish counterattack towards Grodno, the First Army had to retreat behind Neman River and was soon pushed further back. The whole front was rolled back. In the south, in Galicia, General Semyon Budyonny's Red Cavalry Army advanced far into the Polish rears, capturing Grodno and approaching Lwow and Zamość. In early July it became clear to the Poles that the Russians' objectives were not limited to pushing the borders farther west. Poland's very independence was at stake. The Russian forces advanced rapidly at a rate of 20 miles a day, shocking many commanders and foreign observers who were expecting a repeat of the Western snail-paced advance. After the capture of Grodno in Belarus on July 19, Tukhachevsky ordered that Warsaw be taken by August 12. When Brest-Litovsk fell on August 1 and the Nare and Bug River were crossed by the Red Army, Soviet forces faced no natural barriers between them and the Vistula River, on which Warsaw was situated. Polish attempt to defend the Bug River line with 4th Army and Grupa Pilecka units stopped the advance of the Red Army for only 1 week. The Red Army advance slowed down, but only to 12 miles a day. Units of the Russian Northwest Front, after taking Lomza and Ostroleka and crossing the Nare River on August 2, approached the 60 miles radius from Warsaw. Fortress of Brzesk, which was to be the headquarters of Polish planned counteroffensive, fell to the 16th Army in the first attack. The Russian Southwest Front had pushed Polish forces out of Ukraine and was advancing on Zamość and Lwow, the metropolis of southeastern Poland and an important industrial center, defended by the Polish 6th Army. Polish Galicia's Lwow was besieged, and 5 Russian armies were approaching Warsaw. Polish forces in Galicia near Lwow launched a counteroffensive to slow the Soviets down. The 6th Army of General Jedrzejewski and elements of the Ukrainian forces defended Lwow, and the 2nd Army and Grupa Operacyjna Jazdy attacked from Steyr towards Brody and Radziwiłło, Masovian Voivodeship. During the Battle of Brody, Polish forces managed to recapture Brody and surround parts of Soviet forces. This had put a stop to the retreat of Polish forces on the southern front, but the worsening situation near Polish capital of Warsaw prevented Poles from continuing that southern counteroffensive and pushing east. After Soviets captured Brzesk, the Polish offensive in the south was put on hold and all available forces forces moved north to take part in the coming battle for Warsaw. Polish and Soviet internal politics. With the turning tide against Poland, Pilsudski's political power had been weakened and his opponents, including Roman Dmowski, had risen to power, but he had regained it as the Soviet forces were approaching Warsaw. The government of Leopold Skulski had resigned and new Prime Minister Stanislaw Grabski had transferred all power to the Rada Obrony Państwa, which consisted of Naczelnik Państwa, Marshal of the Sejm, Prime Minister, 3 ministers, 3 armies representatives and 10 members of the parliament. Grabski's government, supported by the West and diplomats, have attempted to restart peace negotiations with the Soviets, but their attempts were completely ignored by the Soviet side. Stanislaw Grabski resigned and a new government was formed by Wincenty Witos. By order of the Soviet Communist Party, a Polish puppet government, the Provisional Polish Revolutionary Committee, had been formed on the 28th of July in Białystok to organize administration of the Polish territories captured by the Red Army. It was composed of Polish communists and members of the Politburo of the Central Committee, Soviet Communist Party. Julian Marchlewski, Edward Prikniak, Felix Dzerzhinsky, Felix Kohn and Joseph Unslicht. It began operating from the 1st of August, issuing various decrees like nationalization of industry, promising the creation of Polish Socialist Republic, creating 65 revolutionary committees, issuing newspaper Goniec Członi and recruiting soldiers for the One Polish Red Army commanded by R. Lagua. TKRP was disbanded on the 22nd of August. The TKRP had very little support from the ethnic Polish population and recruited its supporters mostly from the ranks of minorities, Belarusians and primarily Jews. At the height of the Polish-Soviet conflict, Jews had been subject to anti-Semitic violence by Polish forces, who considered Jews to be a potential threat and who often accused Jews as being the masterminds of Russian Bolshevism. At one point during the war, Jewish volunteer officers were imprisoned. In Moscow, the delegates to the Second Congress of the Third International followed with enthusiasm the progress of the Russian forces. The delegates began to see Poland as the bridge over which communism would pass into Germany, bolstering the Communist Party of Germany. In addition, political games between Soviet commanders of Soviet fronts grew in the face of the more and more certain victory. Eventually, the lack of cooperation between Soviet commanders would cost them dearly in the upcoming decisive Battle of Warsaw. International reaction. Western public opinion, swayed by the press and by left-wing politicians, was strongly anti-Polish. Many foreign observers expected Poland to be quickly defeated and become the next Soviet republic. Britain proposed negotiations between Poland and Russia to stabilize the border at the Curzon line farther west. But the British proposal was disregarded by the Soviets, who expected a quick victory. Russian terms amounted to total Polish capitulation, and even Lenin stalled in order to give his armies time to take Warsaw and conclude the war to Russia's advantage. Britain's Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, once a strong supporter of Imperial Russia, was now a Soviet sympathizer and authorized British sales of large quantities of armaments to fill urgent Soviet orders, at the same time blocking any British moves to aid Poland. The Polish cause in the United Kingdom was only supported by the head of the British military mission to Warsaw, General Sir Adrian Carpenter Wyatt, and a few politicians led by the Secretary of State for War, Winston Churchill, who advocated moving Royal Air Force units to support Poland. On August 6, 1920, the British Labour Party published a pamphlet stating that British workers are not Poland's allies. The French socialist newspaper, Humanité, declared, "Not a man, not a sou, not a shell for reactionary and capitalist Poland. Long live the Russian Revolution." Long live the Workmen's International! Poland suffered setbacks due to sabotage and delays in deliveries of war supplies when workers in Austria, Czechoslovakia and Germany refused to transit such materials to Poland. In Gdansk, British troops were asked to unload ships with military supplies because the mostly German workers refused to do so. Similar things happened in Czechoslovakia and Brno. Lithuania's stance was mostly anti-Polish, and the country eventually joined the Soviet side in the war against Poland in July 1919. The Lithuanian decision was dictated by a desire to incorporate the city of Wilno and the nearby areas into Lithuania, and to a smaller extent by Soviet diplomatic pressure backed by the threat of the Red Army stationed on Lithuania's borders. The new Lithuanian government decided to make Vilnius the capital of Lithuania, despite it being mainly Polish and Belarusian populated in the 20th century. The Polish-Lithuanian War would continue until the autumn of 1920. The Lithuanian alliance with the Bolsheviks was somewhat countered by Latvia, which, unlike her neighbor, decided to join forces with Poland in the fight against the Soviets. Polish allies were few. France, continuing her policy of countering Bolshevism, now that the whites in Russia proper had been almost completely defeated, sent in 1919 a small advisory group to Poland's aid. This group comprised mostly French officers, although it also included a few British advisers. It was headed by British General Adrian Cartender Wyatt and French General Paul Prosper Henrys. The French mission commanded considerable respect and influence through the activities of its 400 officer instructors. These men, distributed among the cadres of the Polish Star, were entrusted with training the officer corps in military science and in the use of French army manuals. The French effort was vital to improving the organization and logistics of the Polish army, which until 1919 had used diverse manuals, organizational structures and equipment mostly drawn from the armies of Poland's former partitioners. In addition to the Allied advisors, France also facilitated in 1919 the transit to Poland from France of the Blue Army, a force of troops, mostly of Polish origin plus some international volunteers, formerly under French command in World War I. The army was commanded by the Polish General Joseph Haller. The French officers included a future president of France, Charles de Gaulle. Anxious for active service and sharing in the anti-Bolshevik ideology, he joined the 5th Chasseurs Polonais of Haller's army. He fought in the eastern Galicia. Later he lectured on tactics at Remberto near Warsaw. He won Poland's highest military decoration, the Virtuti Militari, but refused a permanent commission in Poland. Upon his return to France he would lecture on military history at Sincere, often drawing upon his experiences of the Polish-Soviet War. The Hungarians, too, who had experienced the acute Elekun's communist regime, became aware that Poles were fighting for the freedom as well. They planned to dispatch a 30,000-man cavalry corps to join the Polish army, but the Czechoslovak government denied them passage across Czechoslovak territory. Their attempts to help Poland succeeded in the crucial period of the war, when several trains loaded with Hungary-made Mauser rifles reached Poland. That help was remembered by Poles as another manifestation of the traditional Polish-Hungarian friendship. In mid-1920 the Allied mission was expanded by some new advisors. They included the French diplomat Jean-Jules Jusseron, Maxime Weygand, Chief of Staff to Marshal Ferdinand Foch, Supreme Commander of the victorious Entente, and a British diplomat, Lord Edgar Vincent Davenant. The newest members of the mission achieved little, indeed. The crucial Battle of Warsaw was fought and won by the Poles before the mission could return and make its report. Subsequently, for many years, the myth persisted that it was the timely arrival of Allied forces that had saved Poland, a myth in which Weygand occupied the central role. Weygand had traveled to Warsaw in the expectation of assuming command of the Polish army, but had found a disappointing reception, aggravated by the fact that around the same time France had frozen its financial aid to Poland. His first meeting with Pilsudski on July 24 began on the wrong foot when he had no answer to Pilsudski's opening question, "How many divisions have you brought?" Weygand had none to offer. On the 27th of July he was installed as advisor to the Polish Chief of Staff, Tadeusz Rozwadowski, but the collaboration went poorly. He was treated with contempt by many Polish officers. His suggestions were regularly disregarded. One of the few officers who treated him fairly was General Władysław Sikorski. After a while, he threatened to leave, which he did shortly after the Polish victory at Warsaw. Before departing on August 25, he was consoled with the Decoration of Virtuti Militari, Polish highest military award. Upon returning to Paris, he was greeted as the victor of the war, receiving another decoration, French this time, the Grand Order of the Legion of Honor. In his memoirs he admitted that the victory was Polish, the plan was Polish, the army was Polish. The myth of his victory would carry on in France and elsewhere, even in academic circles.